Hello, my name is Vivek Nallur. Graham Finlay, my co-author, and I myself are both from University College Dublin. Today, we're going to be talking about ethics in the small. That is, behavior by machines whose effects are not felt as life-altering events, but rather in the everyday humdrum decisions that we take. This current work has its origins in nudge theory. Nudge theory fundamentally shows that people can make repeated, predictable, irrational decisions due to the presence of cognitive biases. These biases exist in all human beings. A nudge is therefore a behavioral intervention that takes advantage of these cognitive biases. A nudge is made or implemented by manipulating the choices, or rather the choice architecture available to the human being making that decision. Certain decisions are made easier or made more difficult based on how the choices are presented to the human being. Despite the repeatability and predictability of human beings, it turns out that nudges don't always work. Each nudge works by exploiting a particular cognitive bias. But it turns out that different human beings have different cognitive biases. There are about 150 known cognitive biases. To complicate matters, these biases in us can change over time based on a number of factors such as stress, environment, or even time of the day. So a nudge that works on me when I'm rushing to get to work in the morning may not work when I'm slightly more relaxed in the afternoon, for example. So if someone wanted to manipulate decisions made by a group of human beings, indiscriminately nudging them is no better than mass advertising. It might work on some people, it might not work on others. Now that we know that arbitrary nudges don't work on arbitrary human beings, the next obvious question is, can we find out which human beings have which biases? And in what context do they work? The ubiquity of smartphones allows us to answer this question. AI, or rather machine learning, can now fine-tune itself to fit the biases of the individual human being carrying that smartphone. That is, due to the large amounts of personal data available to that phone, it is now possible to tailor each nudge based on the specific set of cognitive biases present in that human being. The simplest way to find out what these biases are is to simply try each nudge and record which one succeeds. So if you react better to gamification or competition, or to perceived financial gains, or to a data-driven argument, the AI can simply tailor the nudge to get the reaction it wants. So, how can a smartphone nudge us? Let's take a brief detour. Conversational AI, or chatbots as they're commonly known, have become an acceptable part of online interaction. From customer care on websites to apps that communicate via seemingly natural language text, agents that can hold a conversation are now becoming ubiquitous. These agents exist in obvious conversation-enabled devices such as Alexa, Google Assistant, or Siri, but also in devices such as smartphones, smartwatches, Fitbits, etc. Given that we spend almost all our waking hours in close or constant contact with a smart device, it is trivial for the device to nudge our attention to news, views, decision options that it considers important. The easiest form of creating an adaptable nudge is through conversation. Language is almost infinitely flexible in conveying emotion, urgency, friendliness, detachedness, disappointment, anger, hurt, and so on. In fact, do you see the nudge on this slide? Unlike other hyper-personal toys or gadgets, the chatbot inside the phone actively creates a shared space, which human beings trust. Till recently, the machine's conversation has been distinguishable from another human being's by virtue of the language that the machine employed. However, this is no longer the case. State-of-the-art language models such as GPT-3 can present text which looks spookily like a human talking. At our current state of technology, a human can easily be fooled into thinking that the entity talking back to them through the phone is a real being with feelings. Unfortunately, there is no actual emotion behind the text generated from the machine. Given this state of affairs, how do we set standards for human-machine conversation such that trust can be built and maintained?
Well, it's now my turn to take over, and I just want to thank you all for listening to this. So there have been a lot of philosophical questions and discussions, indeed, about conversation and how it should be carried on, particularly in the area of politics or in the terms of individual autonomy. And some of these theories have extremely strong philosophical understandings about what rational autonomy is. Most obviously the case of Jürgen Habermas, who is the leading discourse ethicist and indeed the leading theorizer of conversation, who takes a particularly Kantian understanding of rational autonomy as giving yourself a rational principle such that no heterogeneous factors play a role in your decision making. Now, that is philosophically controversial. It is also perhaps too demanding in terms of evaluating human-machine interaction and its potential benefits in the case of the chatbots that we're talking about. So, and now, that may be good. It may be good to roll out nudging altogether, but it seems to do so. And we can imagine that there are strong benefits to having some suitably guarded use of conversational chatbots that get us what we really do want. And so we're going to look at different ways of understanding it, which maybe don't require such controversial and indeed rigorous exclusion of chatbots altogether. One place to look is the European Commission's guidelines for trustworthy AI, since trust is indeed what we're concerned about here. These guidelines are grounded in fundamental and human rights, and they contain the key human rights procedural commitments to participation, transparency, and accountability with regards to the various people whose human rights you're seeking to vindicate. They're not based on any controversial philosophical premises about what autonomy is, but unfortunately, on the other hand, they don't have a particularly developed or even extensive discussion of what cognitive bias is and when it should be avoided or when it should not be used to manipulate agents. So it also has they also have a relatively weak commitment to these procedural commitments, which are largely at the engineering stage where these concerns should be taken into consideration. Whereas we ask, and all of these procedural questions require us to ask, well, transparent and accountable to whom? Whose participation and how? Right? Now, Thaler and Sunstein's approach is almost notoriously top-down in its nudging and is largely based on the benefits to society as a whole, and indeed, perhaps by extension, the benefits to individual members of society. It's good that we should take out a pension, right? Even if we don't really want to, or we keep forgetting to, or whatever. This top-down approach does not, we argue, allay participants' legitimate concerns about trust when it comes to conversational AI. And indeed, I think we can learn something from Jan Elster's pioneering work surrounding the way in which we can pre-commit to things which will alter our choices in the moment on the basis of either a democratic agreement to be bound by the decisions of our democratic consensus, right, or democratic majorities, right? Or in terms of our own individual pre-commitments to allowing some particular device or perhaps other people to make decisions for us or to prevent us from doing what we want to do in the moment. His example, and the title of his article, is Ulysses and the Sirens. Ulysses has his men tie him to the mast so he can hear the siren song, knowing that as soon as he hears it, he'll want to jump off the boat and swim towards the sirens and perish. So he tells them, under no circumstances untie me, even if I plead with you or threaten you or whatever. These pre-commitments are perhaps more the kind of pre-commitments we should be looking for. Accordingly, we need pre-commitments at the level of the individual, or as close as possible to the level of the individual. For many of the groups we're talking about for whom these chatbots can bring considerable benefit, they may experience diminished responsibility. They either through dementia or other severe cognitive impairments or other factors which prevent them from even availing of the minimal autonomy which we might see as characterizing other members of society. This follows the well-known European principle of subsidiarity, which sees decisions as needing to be made as close to the lowest level as possible, compatible with effective decision-making and effectiveness of the resulting decisions. This is a refinement and a change in emphasis of the understandings of bias and stakeholders in the guidelines on trustworthy AI, with a greater focus on cognitive bias and a much more robust and local understanding of what who the stakeholders are. It requires different structures for the democratic dialogues and the perhaps regulatory oversight of conversational AI. And the focus is always going to be on the individual agency and protecting of human rights for the people concerned. And this is especially true of vulnerable groups. And of course, this has consequences for the design process and the design principles which inform the construction of these chatbots and should be present at every stage of the process. We want to thank you all for listening, and I hope that we can all have a good conversation about some of these issues once this video stops playing. So thank you very much.